think that's the best stuff to listen to. So, and appropriate for our visit today with the Birthplace of Country Music, with Renee Rogers and with Scotty Omany. We're so glad that they're with us today, but just a few things to get started with. My name's Lisa Oakley. I'm Curator of Education with the East Tennessee Historical Society, and we enjoyed our virtual visit last week with Ranger Rexroad at Telco Blockhouse and had a great group for that visit on Zoom as well as Facebook Live. And if you're interested in seeing that, we will be having that on our YouTube's page soon, but it's also on Facebook on the ETHS Facebook page. So if you're not friends with us or if you haven't liked the page, please go and find us, and you can keep up with our virtual visits there as well if you miss one. And we will have a virtual visit next week to Ramsey House here in Knox County with the director there, Kelly Weatherly Sinclair, and she will be taking us on a tour and telling us about the Ramseys and Ramsey House, and that will be at 1 o'clock next week. We will tell you more about that at the end as well. But if you're interested, just email the same email address you used to RSVP for this event, and we will get you that information for next week so that you can log on to the Zoom event. But remember, it's all Facebook Live as well at 1 o'clock next Thursday. And we will be looking at different options for times of the day. We do want to keep it kind of in that lunchtime, but a lot of people are going back to work. And so we'll see what seems to be a good time to offer these. But for right now, next week, it'll be at 1. And we do hope then, starting in June, to offer these every other week or so. And we will get a schedule, a little bit ahead of time so people can know what to expect and have those on their calendar and continue to join us for these virtual visits around the region to museums, historic sites. We also are thinking about some other kind of libraries and archives, and maybe even give you a behind the scenes view of some of the things going on here at the East Tennessee History Center. So thank you again for joining us. Again, my name is Lisa Oakley. I'm curator of education here at the East Tennessee Historical Society, and you will meet Stephanie Henry at the end of our event. She will be conducting the question and answer session. And again, everyone's microphones are on mute, but you can, during the visit with Renee and with Scotty and Birthplace of Country Music, if you have questions, you'll see the chat box, a feature that's on your toolbox, or your toolbar, I should say, and just type in your questions there, and we will be gathering those questions, and Stephanie will conduct that session at the end of our visit so that we can get your questions answered. If you're on Facebook, just post those comments there as well, any questions, and we'll get those answered. I think that's mainly what we wanted to share. Let me just check and see if there's anything else. I mentioned next week we'll be going to Ramsey House. You will see more information and more advertisement about that, but you have the preview on that, and so just go ahead and email the ETHS email address you used if you would like to RSVP for that event, and we will get you on the list and get you the information. But at any rate, welcome. We're excited about this opportunity. This is something new for us. It's kind of a discovery. We're doing a lot of historic things these days, and a lot of those historic things are virtual. And I know that the Birthplace of Country Music in Bristol has been endeavoring to get into the digital world too, and doing a lot of things while we're not in our buildings, to connect with you and to serve you, our audience, our members, our supporters. You all mean the world to us, and we have worked very hard to stay connected. And this is just one of those opportunities. So I think that Renee Rogers is the head curator for the Birthplace of Country Music, and Scotty works with their digital media and exhibits. And I think they snuck in the building so that they could give us a little bit of a special view and a special tour to see what they have available. And they'll talk a little bit about what they have available online and digitally as well. But we do hope everyone will physically go and visit when the opportunity is available and that can work out. But again, another thing about the chat box, it's great for your questions, but also if there are things we want to share, links, that sort of information during our visit, we will post those things to the chat box so that you can find that information, including we've already posted the web link to the Birthplace of Country Music's website. But I think I'm going to turn it over now to Renee, and welcome to you and Scotty. And we're just glad to be here with you today. So please share with us what you have there at the Birthplace of Country Music.
Hi everyone, I'm Renee. First things first is that I just want to thank the East Tennessee Historical Society and all of you virtual visitors for being here with us today. What we're going to do is spend about 20 minutes up here in the permanent exhibits at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, and then we're going to head downstairs to check out some behind the scenes items from our vault and our current special exhibit so that you have a chance to sort of just get an idea of the things that we do here. And like Lisa said, I hope that you'll then come and visit us again when we are reopened. But first, let's start with what the Birthplace of Country Music Museum is all about. We get a lot of questions about why we're called the Birthplace of Country Music. And one of the first questions we get is, isn't that Nashville? Of course. But the reason why we are called the Birthplace of Country Music is because of a very specific recording session that happened here in 1927. And when you think about what happened then, it's really sort of the birth of early commercial country music, because obviously this music had been around for a long time before it actually got recorded here in Bristol. It had been recorded in other places before Bristol. Several artists like Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers, Ernest Stoneman, fiddlin', John Carson, fiddlin' Cowan Powers, they had all recorded before 1927 in other field recordings and location recordings, and also in some of the big studios up in New York City and other bigger cities. But in 1927, something special happened here in Bristol, and that's why we are known as the Big Bang of country music. I call it sort of the perfect storm of events that happened here in 1927. The first element of that is Ralph Pierre. You can see him here behind me on this panel. And Ralph Pierre was a record producer from the Victor Talking Machine Company. He had been hired specifically by them to enhance their Hillbilly catalog. They saw other labels starting to record this kind of old-time traditional music. And so he was working on making that something that the Victor Talking Machine Company could make some money from. And the thing about Ralph Pierre is that there were a lot of record producers out there and they all knew their jobs really well, but Ralph Pierre really had his finger on the pulse of what people were interested in, how to market and distribute it. And he was not only making inroads and huge influential decisions in the hillbilly music genre, but he was also making it in race records and later in his career in Latin music. And what's really great about Ralph Pierre is that what he did has a huge legacy. He started in 1926, right before 1927 Bristol Sessions, he started a company called the Southern Music Publishing Company. And it became the largest independent family-owned music publishing company in the world, which is now still here and has offices all over the country and is run by his son. So it still has a huge impact. And the other thing about Ralph Pierre that's special is that he really sort of transformed the way copyright was being treated, looking at copywriting performances, copywriting the version of the song, writing out management contracts with the performers themselves. So really making some of the foundational decisions that really are what the country music and the music industry in general are made up of today. So that was one of the first elements. The second element was technology. And here we have the Western electric microphone. This is not the actual microphone that was used at the sessions, but it is the same brand and year that it was used. So the same type and model. And before 1927, most of these recordings in all the different genres of music were being made on the acoustic horn. And the acoustic horn was basically a big phonograph-looking horn, like a megaphone that you sort of sang into, and you had to get up close, so the artist had to move around a bit. They had to come up close to that to sing in. You couldn't get a whole huge group, and especially with string bands where there was lots of different levels of sound coming from those instruments, it wasn't always capturing that sound great. So when the electric microphone came about, and that was right before the Bristol Sessions around 1926, and those were, these are one of the first major recording sessions that used that technology. It meant that the actual quality of those records was better and more nuanced, more balanced sound, more vibrant. So of course that means people are going to buy those records in more quantities. They're going to be more interested in them. And then finally, the third and probably the biggest element in this perfect storm of events were the artists who were recorded here. Ernest Stoneman, who had recorded almost 100 sides with various record labels before 1927, came, and he was very influential on Ralph Pierre coming to the Bristol sessions. He recorded here with his family and friends in a bunch of variations. But for the very first time, we had Jimmie Rodgers from Meridian, Mississippi, and the Carter family from just up the road in Mesa Spring, Virginia, who came here and recorded for the very first time. Neither one of those have recorded before. So they performed before, but they had not recorded. And both of those are probably the most influential acts in country music. The Carter family is known as the first family of country music. Jimmie Rodgers is known as the father of country music. Couple that with the influence of Ernest Stoneman, and you have some hugely influential recordings. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about genre and instruments now. So in this part of our exhibit, we have several of the instruments that would have been played on the Bristol sessions. None of these are actually session instruments. And the reason behind that is because so many of the instruments that the musicians were playing back then were Sears and Roebuck, mail order catalog instruments, ones that didn't cost a huge amount of money. And or they might have been handed down through the generations, through their families. And the other thing is people didn't know at the time that they were making history. So a lot of these instruments are still with the families, or perhaps have been destroyed by accident, broken, thrown away, passed on, sold, whatever. So a lot of the instruments are either still with the families or just not out there at all anymore. But what we did instead was sort of gather up instruments that represented the main instruments of the string band and some of the sort of peripheral instruments that were also played in this kind of music, things like the bones, the autoharp, the kazoo, the Jew's harp, but then also the main string band instruments, the guitar, the fiddle, and the banjo, just so that people get a sense of what kind of instruments were being played. And we've also tried to make these iconic, important instruments that are tied to artists that are tied into this music. So of course, the music that came after this hillbilly sound, bluegrass in particular, we've got instruments from Bill Monroe, a mandolin, we've got an Earl Scruggs banjo, and we've got a Ralph Stanley banjo. And then one of our most interesting instruments, well, a couple actually. We have here an autoharp that is made from the floorboards of A.P. Carter's cabin. It was made by George Orthy, and what's interesting about it is that that's not really a great tone wood that it's made from, but it's got this wonderful connection to the Carter family. So it doesn't play quite as beautifully as an autoharp that's been made from the right tone wood, but it's a beautiful instrument, and it was owned by Jeanette Carter and is signed by her. And then also, this is one of my favorite instruments over here, the harp guitar. This is an instrument that has an interesting, obviously it's sort of the Frankenstein version of an instrument. It's a combination of the harp, the idea of harp strings, with the guitar body and the guitar neck. And it's played in a really interesting way. If you want to go online and Google Stephen Bennett, who is a well-known harp guitar player, you can see a picture of him here with his really intricate arched harp guitar top. You can get an idea of what that sounds like. But one of the artists from the 1927 Bristol sessions, Alfred Carnes, was a well-known harp guitarist, and a lot of scholars debate whether or not he brought that harp guitar to Bristol and played it on the Bristol sessions. There are some scholars who swear they can hear it on a couple of the songs, and there's others who swear that it's just the guitar. So it's a debate that hasn't been resolved. The family hasn't been able to answer that question for us, but it gives you an idea of some of the really interesting instruments that were being played and the huge level of skill. Most of these artists were multi-instrumentalists. They weren't just playing one instrument, they were playing lots. Especially you think of someone like Ernest Stoneman, who was creating these different configurations of bands. You know, he played both as himself with various artists. He played as the Ernest Stoneman and his Dixie Mountaineers. He played as the Blue Ridge Cornshuckers, which almost had a jug band feel to it. And they were all playing different instruments throughout this. And that brings us to our next topic, and that is the idea of genre. I've mentioned a couple of times hillbilly music, and for those of us who are from East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, that can be sort of a charged kind of word, hillbilly, because a lot of times we get called hillbillies and it's not meant in a very nice way. But this was the actual term that was used by Ralph Pierre and by the other record labels who were recording this music to to call this old time music. It was what they called the genre. And the reason, this is sort of the height of when genre was being drawn out and being emphasized. They were looking at the different audiences who wanted to buy this music and appealing to them by naming that music specifically for them. So for instance, for that old time traditional music that we think of as old string band music, it was called hillbilly music. And you also had a lot of African-American artists around this area. Of course, there's a huge influence from the African instrument of the banjo and string band music, and a lot of influence in the way it was being played by African-American and Black and musicians on the in the Appalachian area being brought into the music that we're talking about. That even when you had Black artists playing music that was very similar, I mean, a lot of them were playing this string band music, they would call the genre race records because they had this idea that they were appealing to a specific audience and therefore it had to be named that way. This was something that if you look on a lot of the record labels, not the record labels, the record sleeves from this time, it'll actually have a list of the different types of music that you can buy from them. And it'll have hillbilly music, race records, polka, Latin, gypsy music, all sorts of different genres outlined on that, almost like the way when you go to Amazon today, if you like this music, you might like this music, and it gives you a suggestion. It's giving you a suggestion right there on the record sleeve of what you might want to buy in other genres. And one of the things that's really interesting, especially about some of the Black musicians that were out there at this time, on the actual Bristol sessions, there was only one act, L. Watson, who performed at the 1927 Bristol sessions. He performed both on his own and with the Johnson Brothers. And those recordings with the Johnson Brothers are actually some of the earliest integrated country music recordings that we know of. But the person that I'm most interested in, because he just has such a wonderful story, is Leslie Riddle, who you can see up here at the top of this panel. And Leslie Riddle traveled around with A.P. Carter after the 1927 Bristol sessions. They met when Leslie was living in Kingsport, Tennessee. When A.P. Carter was on one of his own song catching trips, he met Leslie there and got some music off of him. But they ended up traveling together on several song catching trips all over the South in this Appalachian area. And if you can imagine that, we're talking about the segregated South. They were traveling together, probably not able to eat in the same places. AP was often having to find friends who would put up Leslie because he wasn't able to stay in the same places that AP Carter was staying in or eat in the same places. But Leslie Carter was learning the music. AP Carter was writing down the lyrics, and then they'd come back to the homestead of the Carter family, and AP and Sarah and Maybelle would work up those songs into the songs that they started recording. So Leslie Riddle was a huge part of the Carter family story, and in fact was highly influential on Maybelle Carter's development of the Carter scratch, which is probably one of the most important and well-known styles used in guitar playing. So that's an interesting part of the story. I mentioned earlier about the impact of technology on the story of the 1927 Bristol sessions. So I wanted us to go and look at some of the other technology that was part of that story. While we're going through here, you'll see a little bit of other areas in the museum. We have a chapel here that's built in the museum to talk about the gospel and sacred music, another part of that genre that was important to this music. And the other thing is, when you're actually visiting the museum, what you're going to hear in every room is sound. There is music in every part of this museum. Soundscapes that go along with the story that we're telling, or music that's very specific to the time frame that we're talking about. So you never are able to, I mean, you're never away from music, which is a wonderful feeling. Obviously, we turn that off so you can actually hear me. But when you visit us in person, get really a sound. This area here is a great place to talk about the technology. We have a live radio station here in the museum. It's WBCM Radio Bristol. If you go on our website to the tab for radio, you can listen online streaming, or you can download the app onto your smartphone. But what's great about this is during the day, 24/7, there is music coming out of this museum from our radio station, and it is being accessed by people all over the country and also people in other countries. And during the day when we have visitors here, they might see our DJs in there doing their jobs, doing their shows. We have shows that are probably about 30 unique programs that come out of Radio Bristol here in the museum. They might see a band in here who's coming to perform live on the show. We also have something called Radio Bristol Book Club, where once a month we talk about a book related to the music content of the museum or about the Appalachian musical heritage. And you'll see us in here having that Radio Bristol Book Club discussion and sometimes even talking to the author. But the technology that was being developed in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is hugely part of the story of the 1927 Bristol Sessions and just the story of early recorded music in general. And that's why we do have a lot of that technology on display here in the museum. From like cylinder players to the big gramophones, phonographs that were like a piece of furniture and that you bought in the furniture store. You didn't go to a music store, you bought this and your records in a furniture store. To when it started coming into the radio and the different types of radios that you might have, from the crystal radio sets to battery tube sets, to the smaller radio sets, the kind of things that you could use that were more portable, like tape players, CD players, 8-track players that didn't have a long lifetime but were there for a while, and even some of the first MP3 players. It's so different from the way we listen to music today. And that's one of the really cool lessons that we actually do here at the museum with kids and adults, is looking at that history of how music has been listened to and how the concept and the idea of sound and how sound is created, how sound is received, how that has influenced it, and how that is important. Because of course this music was being distributed on those 78 records. People were going to the furniture stores to buy those records. They were listening to the radio. They were listening to all the barn dances and the Grand Ole Opry and the WLS farm dance. And here locally, they were listening to something called Farm and Fun Time, which takes us back to our radio station. Let's sort of pan back over there because I want to tell you a little bit more about that. And see if Scotty can get a good view inside the actual booth here. Because what's really cool about this radio station is that it's a modern, digitally advanced radio station, but all of the equipment in it is actually from our local WCYB and WOPI radio stations from the 1940s and 50s. So it's the old equipment from those radio stations that has been remastered for digital delivery. And so you get the sense of what an old radio booth would have actually felt like, but we're still able to provide you with this hugely high quality, advanced sound from a radio station. And we're able to rejuvenate that Farm and Fun Time show. So that was very similar to the barn dances, a variety show where you had performers, you had farm reports, you had agricultural discussions, you had the homemade jingles for all the different things that were being sold. And Farm and Fun Time now is something that we air monthly here from the museum. Up until recently, that's been in front of a live studio audience. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to that soon. But it's great because we have our housebound band who writes their own jingles. We have someone who delivers an heirloom recipe that tells you all about a wonderful cooking recipe or a food way from the Appalachian South. We have a farm report where our radio staff goes out to different farms in the area that are doing sustainable, wonderful practices and talks about that. We've even been to the fish farmery and looked at trout eggs. That was pretty exciting. But this radio station gives us a really great chance to share more of the museum content beyond our doors, to share the history. All of our DJs are so well couched in that history, are talking about it and sharing it with us. A lot of them are musicians themselves. They're part of the local music scene. And that means that they're able to share a really wonderful, in-depth story beyond our doors. And everything that's going on in this museum is about getting people to look beyond what they've seen here and think about that music, listen to it, engage with it, and learn about it. And two final things I wanted to talk about before we go downstairs. One is just really quickly is Mr. Tennessee Ernie Ford. Since I'm talking to a Tennessee audience primarily, everyone will have heard of Tennessee Ernie Ford, I'm sure, but he is a Bristol native. He got his start on WOPI radio here in Bristol. He went on to become one of the best known radio personalities in the 40s and 50s, and then on to become one of the best known television and recording personalities. He has a Hollywood Walk of Fame star, 3 Hollywood Walk of Fame stars for radio, recording, and television. And we're very fortunate to have a great deal of objects related to his career and his life, both from the family and from his time on those shows. His birthplace is here in Bristol that you can visit through the Bristol Historical Association. And we've done a lot of work with trying to preserve his history and his story, because he also has a huge impact later in country music and in music in general, especially gospel and sacred music. And that's one thing final to talk about before we go downstairs, and that is the idea that even though the story here is based around the 1927 Bristol sessions, does not stop with the 1927 Bristol sessions. We want to emphasize to everyone who visits us, who learns about us, who engages with us online and through the radio station and through our social media, that there is a legacy that goes way beyond that moment. Those recordings are called the Big Bang of country music because of who recorded here, because of the expertise that was behind it, because of the technology, because of how much influence that had on the early commercial country music. And because so many artists today, not just in country music, but in genres all over, all types of genres, and musicians all over the world can harken back and talk about the influence of these musicians on their sound today. And you can see that in what was going on in the 60s urban folk revival, but you can also see it going on in the festival culture that all of us probably enjoy today. We have a wonderful festival here in Bristol every September, the Bristol Rhythm and Roots Reunion, that celebrates this roots, hillbilly, bluegrass, Americana music, and so many of the artists there, you can find direct ties either through family or through the songs that they're singing or through the way that they style themselves, or the way they style their music to the music that started here. And so that's something that we always want people to remember, is that there's a legacy beyond it that continues today, and that it's something, I know when we have kids that come through here, they get excited when I tell them that the song that was played by the Geneva Ramblers here in Bristol in 1927, The Longest Train I Ever Saw, which a lot of people know more popularly as In the Pines, was played on a Walking Dead episode. And they're like, what? They get pretty excited about that. So just knowing that that music is not stagnant, the story isn't stagnant. And we really hope that you'll come visit us here. But next, we're gonna head downstairs. We're gonna go out through the Atrium, where you can also see stuff about the local history of Bristol and the area. We're gonna go have a quick look at some things from the vault and the new special exhibit. So follow me. So this is the opening atrium. This is where you come right before you go into the main galleries of the tour, and we do give a lot of context to what was happening in 1927 and running up to 1927 about the history of Bristol, and also about what was happening on the national historic stage and what was happening in the history of technology, specifically sound and radio. And then also one of my favorite things, this wonderful quilt that was made for us by some local quilters and embroiderers, that is probably the most stunning piece of art we have in the museum. A lot of love and care went into that over 2 years making that quilt. So we'll head into the gallery now. We'll say hi to Summers who passed by. And we're going to take just a couple of minutes to look at a few items in our vault that have come out of our vault. This is behind the scenes look, so not a lot of people get this. So, and what Scotty and I pulled out today is that we tried to pull out things that were related directly to the 1927 Bristol Sessions artists, or some of that history I talked about just a minute ago. So most of these are to do with artists, and one of the things that we've been really fortunate about is that we've had very good relationships with the descendants of the 1927 Bristol Sessions artists. And they have shared wonderful stories. We have lots of oral histories from them about their grandfathers or their grandmothers or their aunts or their uncles or anyone that they were related to who might have performed here in 1927. And a lot of them have also shared artifacts with us and that have become part of the museum collection. And one of the most special things that we have are these dog tags here. You can put those down, and Scotty can get a bit closer so you can see them. These are the dog tags of one of the sacred and gospel singers at the 1927 Bristol Sessions, Ernest Phipps. He came here both in 1927 and when Ralph Pierre came back to Bristol to record in 1928. He came originally with a small group called Ernest Phipps and His Holiness Quartet. And then he came back in 1928 with a whole bunch more and called it Ernest Phipps and His Holiness Singers. The recordings that they did at Bristol were actually the very first recordings we have of holiness music, that sort of really energetic, hand clapping, foot stomping type music, a very different kind of sacred music than what you heard with some of the more structured shaped note singing and that type of things that were more common. But Ernest Phipps was in the Army during World War II. He actually went into the Army as an older man and worked as a medic here in the States during World War II. And his family has donated his dog tags. The other thing that's really cool is this Autoharp set. And this is actually a Sears Autoharp set that you could buy. And it gave you the instructions on how to play like Mother Maybelle Carter. So it didn't belong to her, but it was like a beginner's Autoharp. It gave you where all the keys were. It had it all written out and labeled with instructions on how to play like Mother Maybelle and a record of her playing the Autoharp so that you could be another Mother Maybelle Carter yourself. And that's really fun, I think. Another really interesting thing is this Jimmie Rodgers picture disc. If you can see that, the record itself is completely covered in a photograph, an image of Jimmie Rodgers. And this is Cowhand's Last Ride. On the back, we have Blue Yodel number 12. And I think what's great about this is it's kind of, again, like I said, that modern Amazon. All of his other yodels are advertised on here. So once you bought this, you need to go buy the others. Excuse me. But picture discs were sort of like a promotional thing. You could play them, some of them. Some of them weren't playable. Some of them were really fragile, but some of them were more sturdy like this one. And you saw these a lot, especially in the 1930s. They sort of started picking up in popularity then and then later. And we were very fortunate to have this one donated to us. A couple of other things here. George Massengill, who was the leader of the Tennessee Mountaineers, which was a congregational choir that came to Bristol to sing just from Bluff City, Tennessee, so just about 15 minutes down the road. His family donated a console radio, which we were going to show you, but it was too heavy to get out of the vault. So we brought out his hat instead that was also donated to us by the family. What's really cool about George Massengill is that when he came here with his congregational choir, he brought his daughter with him, Georgia Warren. She was 12 years old at the time. And she talks about, she was the last living survivor of the 1927 Bristol Sessions when we opened in 2014. She helped cut the ribbon at our opening ceremony. She passed away in 2016. But we were very fortunate to have a lot of time with her to get some of the stories and to hear from her family. And one of my favorite stories is that when they recorded in 1927, it was actually around the same time that Jimmie Rodgers was recording, and she actually saw him. And she remembers him being pretty cute. She was 12 years old. She thought he was really cute and sort of had a little bit of a crush on him, which was a lovely story. But also, she's one of the people who gave us a real sense of what it would have been like when they recorded, because they did that not in a professional recording studio, but in a building called the Taylor Christian Hat Company building, which was an old warehouse that they borrowed for the 2 weeks of the recording in July and August 1927. It was set up with rugs and blankets that were all put up to sort of muffle the sound. The actual recording equipment was hidden behind those rugs so that no one could see it, and the only thing they could see was the microphone. And she said it was quite scary because it was dark, it was hot, there was a lot of people crowded around there. And that gave us a real sense of what that might have felt like. And that'll take us to the last thing the last couple of things I wanted to show you. First is a postcard of Bristol that Taylor Christian Hat excuse me, the Taylor Christian Hat Company building no longer stands in Bristol. but we do have postcards from that period that show it. And we also have this postcard from the actual company that again was donated to us by a family member of the family that owned this business back in the 1920s. And then finally, I mentioned Tennessee Ernie Ford upstairs, so I wanted to show one of the WOPI microphones that we have. You can see the labeling on both sides and then NBC on the front. This was one of the microphones that he would have used. And we have a second one of those up in the radio station that's used actually for some of our recording up there. That takes us through everything that we really brought out for the vault. So really quickly, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to tell you a little bit about our current special exhibit. The museum has a 2,000 square foot special exhibit gallery, and we rotate the exhibits in here about every 4 to 6 months, so we usually have 2 to 3 a year. This one sadly opened up just a week and a half before we had to close due to COVID-19. So we have been in the process of putting up a virtual tour of this exhibit on our website. If you go to the birthplaceofcountrymusic.org, to the museum tab under current special exhibit, you'll get a link to those. We're releasing a new video focused in on the exhibit itself. It's called Real Folk, Passing on Trades and Traditions Through the Virginia Folk Life Apprenticeship Program. And basically, we have over 100 images in here that cover about 20 years of the Virginia Folk Life Apprenticeship Program, where master artists and eager apprentices work together to pass on a trade or a craft or a musical heritage to someone who wants to learn that, so that it's not something that gets lost to the ages. It's something that is getting passed down in the generations. And a lot of those apprentices do go on to become master artists themselves who might apprentice someone in the future. But what's really wonderful about it is the huge diversity of trades and crafts that are represented, and the huge diversity of people that are represented. Because it's not just the kind of things that you think of when you're in Appalachia: fiddling, banjo making, mandolin making, country ham curing, but it's also things like salt making and snake cane carving. This is one of my favorite items, because the man who carved this was so accurate that the number of scales that species would have is carved onto the snake. And he basically carved a snake cane for every single snake indigenous to Virginia before he passed away. But also a lot of the immigrant traditions that have come into Virginia. So we have Mexican folkloric dance, we have balalaika playing from Russia, we have classical Iranian and Persian music from a wonderful master artist up in Northern Virginia. But we also have things like African American quilting, gospel music, square dance calling, you name it. There's a wonderful person out there who's sharing that trade or tradition with a young person, or sometimes their own son or daughter, or someone who's decided they want to learn something new because they're young at heart. So there's all sorts of wonderful trades and traditions represented here. And I would really encourage you to go check out those virtual tours online. And they also include educational activity sheets for kids to go along with the exhibit. So that's a lot of fun. And I guess that leads me to the final thing I really wanted to talk about that the museum does. We've talked a lot about what you would see when you come and visit us when we reopen our doors. But in the meantime, we do have a tab on our website. Again, if you go to birthplaceofcountrymusic.org to the museum tab, there's a sub-tab called Museum at Home that has a huge amount of resources. For those of you who don't know, the Birthplace of Country Music Museum is also a Smithsonian affiliated museum. So we also link there to a lot of the Smithsonian resources that are great for kids and adults. But we have everything on there. We have how you can access our Radio Bristol station and how you can go back and listen to archived shows. Live performances that we've had here at the museum that you can watch those performances, or things from the festival, the Bristol Rhythm and Roots Reunion Festival, that you can watch online. Our BCM blog, Listen While I Tell, from Bristol's Birthplace of Country Music and Beyond is a great place to dive deeper into our content. We have things like instrument interviews where we interview instruments and they tell us answers to 10 of our questions, to our Radio Bristol DJs tell you what their favorite album is or their favorite singer is, to behind the scenes at the museum and things that dive deeper into the actual content. We also have under our education tab, a whole section of activity sheets that we've been creating, ranging from a coloring sheet about Ernest Stoneman to songwriting Mad Libs to all sorts of other great things. So I'd really encourage people to explore us online, to subscribe to our social media feeds, because there's always a lot of great stuff there. And please, to come and visit us once this pandemic has made it easier for people to get around and to be around each other, because we would really love to welcome you here. And that's where I'm going to end it for today. Thank you. Oh, yes, of course, we have the Q&A coming up, and I know that Stephanie is going to take over now and sort of start that process.
Thanks, Renee. Yes, we'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. Right now, the question that we have is from Facebook, and it says, is Renee related to Jimmie Rodgers?
You know, not that I know of. I need to do, yeah. And here's Scotty, by the way, because he can also answer questions. So I am not related to Jimmie Rodgers that I know of. I wish I was, because that'd be a great story, but we are the unusual Rodgers, since we both spell our names with a D instead of just with a G.
If anybody else has any questions, please feel free again to add those to the chat box feature. I'll read them from there and can pass them along to Renee. We have one more. Any interesting research projects right now?
Yes, so we are talking about a special exhibit that we want to create to be in the museum about 2 years from now. So we are starting the research for that. It's going to be an exhibit about women in old-time music. We're just in the process of starting to talk to some potential guest curators who will work with us, people like Amethyst Kia, who's a wonderful local musician who has a lot of history in old-time music. So we're starting that research process, but we're also getting ready to, whenever we have a special exhibit, we try and do something supplementary to that exhibit. So our next special exhibit after Real Folk is an exhibit about honky tonk. It's honky tonk images from the photographer Henry Horenstein. So we will be doing some of our own supplementary research to go along with that, to have some supplementary displays and programming. So we'll also be starting that research. Scotty, what else? Because I know there's some stuff we were going to be doing, because we also were going to do some conference papers this summer that we'll probably still work on for the future. You could tell them a little bit about the Farm and Fun Time disc.
Yes, I guess, when did that project start, you think? I guess sometime
2017, 2018.
Yeah, sometime in 2018 we won a voting contest from Virginia Museum Association.
It's the Virginia Association of Museums, and if y'all are confused why Virginia is part of this conversation, yeah. Bristol is on the state line, so half of us is in Virginia and half of us is in Tennessee.
So at some point, I want to say it was 2018 when we got the disc, someone donated a transcription disc that was very badly delaminated, which means it was just flaking off in segments. We won an at-risk objects competition that year to get funding to have it digitized through NEDCC, the Northeastern Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts. So we were able to get the disc up there. I actually hand delivered it because we didn't want to ship it. And they have a technology called Irene that is a series of high-speed cameras, 2D and 3D, and they take like segmented from the horizontally of the disc and recreate the pattern of the grooves and match those back up. And then they have a software. Do you remember what it's called?
I can't. It's something like.
It's a name.
Yeah, it's a name I can't remember.
But they can extract the sonic content of the disc using the images and the software. So we were able to recover the collection Mountain Boys, which was Ralph and Carter Stanley from, I think it was sometime in the late 40s, early 50s. And that was a really neat project that we did.
Yeah, and I think what's also cool about that is Farm and Fun Time, the show that I was talking about that we've rejuvenated, was aired from WCYB radio in the 1940s and 50s. But it was a place where a lot of the really influential early bluegrass performers got their start, were really sort of first coming to notice, and that included the Stanley Brothers, that included Jim and Jesse McReynolds, and a couple of others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But it was very influential on the history of bluegrass music. So having that connection is really cool, to have that be the transcription disc that someone just found in a dumpster and donated to us. So that was pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think we're going to try to do some more programming with that, but we debuted that audio before the February Farm and Fun Time broadcast.
And you can find that archive on our website, so you could go listen to that.
And it should be, I think it's on our YouTube page as well.
All right, well, it looks like that wraps up the questions. There is one comment I wanted to pass along to you, and I'm going to hope I pronounced the last name correctly. Micah and Carrie Dayton here to tell you that you did a great job, and that's to Renee. So
thank you.
a comment that we have, and I agree. This was a great presentation.
Micah.
Well, thank you, and we really appreciate you all coming to us.
Yeah, at this point, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to say again a big thank you to Renee and Scotty and the Birthplace of Country Music for offering this partnership opportunity with us. Just a reminder, our next virtual visit will actually be on June the 4th. That'll be 2 weeks from now with Kelly at Historic Ramsey House. It'll be on Thursday at 1, just like this program. But if anybody has any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at the Historical Society via phone or email, and we'll be happy to help you out as quickly as we can.